Hello everybody. In this Python tutorial, we're going to go over Bokeh. Bokeh is an interactive visualization library. Currently, Bokeh has two main interfaces, Bokeh.models and Bokeh.plotting. Bokeh.models is a lower-level interface that provides the most flexibility to application developers. However, it might take just a little bit more code to get something completed. Bokeh.plotting is a higher-level interface centered around composing visual glyphs. Bokeh can also be used with the HoloViews library, which is also a higher-level interface, and you can do some really cool things with just a little bit of code. Also note that Bokeh.charts is deprecated. For most of the examples in this tutorial, we're going to be using Bokeh.plotting. For more information on the Bokeh package, you can go to python.org and then go to the Python package index and type in Bokeh. Or you can go to the documentation. The current address is here. Then you can click on Installation for install instructions. Then, to get started making your charts and graphs, you can go to the user guide. Next, let's go over a few of the imports that we're going to be using. A few of the standard Bokeh imports we will pull in will be output notebook, show, and reset output. And we will do that using from bokeh.io import. A few more Bokeh imports we'll pull in right now include Bokeh, from bokeh.plotting import figure, and we'll pull in a few more Bokeh imports in the cells that we will actually use them in. Also, we will be using NumPy, Pandas, and the Vega data sets. Next, let's go over just a few things you can do to troubleshoot if you're having problems. If you are using a notebook environment and you don't want your charts and graphs to open up into a new tab, one thing you can do is to use reset output. So you could put that in a cell and run the cell. Then use output notebook. And once again, just put that in a cell and run that cell. And this should allow you to run your code and display the charts and graphs inside the notebook. Also, and we mentioned this just a little bit earlier, Bokeh.charts has been deprecated. So if you're trying to run code using Bokeh.charts with a newer version of Bokeh, it probably will not work. And we're going to be using the Bokeh.plotting with figures instead. Another thing you might try to do if something isn't working quite right is to update to the latest version of Bokeh. Moving on. You can pull in sample datasets using Bokeh, and we have an example of that here. We used from bokeh.sampledata import iris. Then we use iris.flowers, assign that to the iris dataset variable, and we can see a preview of the iris dataset here. And there are many other sample datasets that you can use with Bokeh. For most of our examples, we're going to be using the Vega datasets. Okay, so as we mentioned, to display your charts and graphs inside your notebook, you can use output notebook. And if you're using Google Colab notebooks, output notebook will need to be called in each cell. Otherwise, you should be able to just call it one time. If you would like to open up your charts and graphs in a separate tab, or to save your plots, then you can use output file, and then put in the path of where you would like that to be saved. Also, there is a standard save icon next to most of your plots, and we'll show you that here in just a little bit. Next, let's go over the steps that we will be using to create most of our plots. The first thing you're going to do is to create a figure, and creating the figure is a first step used to create and house your plot. Then you call a plot or glyph method, and examples of those include line plots, bar charts, and scatterplots. And then you go ahead and show or display your figure plot. Next, a special data source used with Bokeh is called the ColumnDataSource. The ColumnDataSource is a data source used throughout Bokeh. Bokeh often creates the ColumnDataSource automatically. However, there are times when it is useful to create them explicitly. The column data source is a dictionary mapping of column names, strings, to sequences of values. The mapping is provided by passing a dictionary with string keys and lists or similar data structures as values. And here we have an example. We use from Bokeh.models, import column data source, then we create our data source. If you would like to view the data in the column data source, then you can use the variable you assign the data to, .data. And you can see the output and what that looks like here. And you'll notice that the column data source looks kind of like a pandas data frame. Okay, now let's go over some examples. For our first example, we're going to create a line plot. That looks like this. Now notice that we have the hover tool that is active for this plot. So we've gone ahead and we've used from Bokeh.models import hover tool. The first thing we do to create our line plot is to pull in our data. So we have our X data and our Y data. Then we go ahead and we create our figure. And this figure is going to have a width of 500 and a height of 325. We've gone ahead and given it a title. And we set the X and Y axis labels. Okay, so that's our figure. Then we go ahead and use the variable that we assign that figure to. Then we decide what kind of plot we want to create, and we're going to create a line plot. Then we put in our X and Y data that we created here. For this example, we're going to include the legend, and we want our line plot to have a line width of 2. To go ahead and add your hover tool, once again, we use the variable that we assigned the figure to, line plot, .add tools. Then we go ahead and pass in hover tool. Now here we have another example of how you can add characteristics to your plot. In this example, this shows how to add axis labels. Now finally, to display or show the plot, we use show, and we go ahead and we pass in the figure variable. Now this pattern that we've used here is very similar to the pattern that we'll use to create most of our charts and graphs. So let's just do a quick review. You go ahead and you create or pull in your data. Then you go ahead and create your figure. Then you determine the type of plot that you would like to use or create. If you would like to add extras, you can do that here. And finally, you go ahead and show or display your plot. So you can see we have our line plot, and we have several tools over here on the right. Now, if you click on the Bokeh icon, that will take you to the Bokeh documentation. Next, we have the pan tool, which, if you click on, allows you to pan around and move your chart. If you click on the box zoom, that allows you to create a box and zoom in on a part of the chart that you select with that box. This icon here is the wheel zoom, so if you click on that, then you should be able to scroll in and out with your trackpad or mouse or whatever you're using, like this. Here we have the save icon. Here we have the reset icon, which allows you to reset the chart or graph, like that. This is one of the tools that we added, which is the hover, and that allows you to hover over part of the chart and give you certain information. And finally, if you want to learn more about Bokeh plot tools, you can click on this little question mark here. And these are just a few of the tools that you can use, and there are many more that you can add. Next up, we have another line chart example. However, in this case, we're going to create several lines. So we've gone ahead and created our data. Then we created our figure. We go ahead and use the figure variable, and we determine what type of chart we want to use, which is a line chart. And we go ahead and we do that for each line of the line chart. And finally, we go ahead and we pass in our figure variable to show. On this one, we've gone ahead and we put the toolbar down at the bottom, using toolbar location below. Now you'll notice in this one we have Output Notebook, which isn't really needed in this case because we've already run Output Notebook once. However, this was originally created in the Google Colab, so you'll notice we have this Output Notebook in several of the cells. in a normal Jupyter Notebook, you should only need to run this once. Let's go ahead and run it. And you can see we get our line chart with multiple lines. Next up, let's go over a few bar chart examples. So here we have a normal bar chart with several columns. To create a simple bar chart, go ahead and create or pull in your data. For the x-axis, we've created our categories using strings. For the y-axis, we've gone ahead and created our number values. So there will be 5 sets of number values that will correspond to each of these categories. Here we've gone ahead and sorted those values so they will display largest to smallest. Then we continue, we create our figure, and for the bar chart, we use the x-range argument and we assign our categories. We've gone ahead and put in a title, labels for the axis, and we set our plot height to 300. Then we determine what type of chart we want to create. We're going to use a vertical bar chart. We go ahead and we pass in our x data and our y data. We assign the y data to the top argument. We want our bars to be blue with a width of 0.5. In this case, we want to make sure that the values axis, the y range, starts at 0, like that. And to do that, we use barchart.yrange.start equals 0. And finally, we go ahead and show to display. Let's run it. And you can see we get our vertical bar chart. If you'd like to use the horizontal bar chart, you can use H bar instead of V bar. Next up, we have a stacked bar chart example. In this case, we're going to go ahead and use a data frame. And we'll also show how this can work with the ColumnDataSource. So here we have our data frame. And if you want to convert that data frame into a ColumnDataSource, then you can do that using this code here. We've gone ahead and created our figure. And to create the horizontal stacked bar chart, we use hbar_stack. For the first argument, we're going to use x1 and x2, this data here. For the second argument, for the y values, we're going to use this data here. We're going to go ahead and set the height to 0.8, and we want the colors to be gray and light gray. Now, something that might be a little bit unique is in this case, since we're using a data frame, and we'll also show you how you can use the ColumnDataSource, you want to go ahead and put in a source argument. So if we use the data frame and we run it, you can see that we get our stacked bar chart. Another thing to point out is that instead of putting in the explicit values here, we've gone ahead and put in what would be equivalent to the values column header. Okay, so that would be the key in this dictionary. Now, instead of the data frame, let's go ahead and use our ColumnDataSource. Let's run it. And you can see we get the same output. Now, as we mentioned in the beginning of the tutorial, column data sources are used quite often with Bokeh. What we've seen in this example, and what appears to work just fine, is that you can use a data frame or the column data source. However, just note that you have to put in that source argument, and instead of putting in the actual values or the variable that represents those values, in this case, notice that we put in the dictionary key or what would be equivalent to the column headers for those values. And also notice that we put those in quotes. Okay? So in this example, we did use the data frame, and that's just something that I experimented with. If you ever have problems using the data frame, go ahead and use the column data source. Okay, next. For this example, we're going to go over how you can create a grouped bar chart or a bar chart with multiple columns. That looks like this. So we've gone ahead and we've used from bokeh.core.properties and we imported value. We've also imported from bokeh.transform import dodge. We've gone ahead and created our data. Here we have our categories, and here we have our data frame, which will use the categories. Then we go ahead and recreate our figure. Once again, we go ahead and we put in that x range argument and we assign the categories. For the y-axis range, we're going to use 0 to 10. And for the plot height, we have 250. Now what we want to do is to create each bar and place it onto the chart. And to do that, we're going to use dodge. And this will offset the bars and place them properly onto the chart, specifically the x-axis. Okay, so for the dodge, we go ahead, we put in our categories. Then we put in a number that represents the offset, which tells where to place the bars on the x-axis. Then for the range, we use our figure variable .xrange. Now we can go ahead and create our vertical bar charts. For the x argument, we put in dodge 1, dodge 2, dodge 3. For the top argument, we go ahead and put in the years. You can see that we created those here. We're going to use a width of 0.2, and in this case, we're going to go ahead and use that source like we just showed in the previous example. And for the source, we're going to use the data source, which is the group bar data frame. We put in our colors and our legend values. Here we've done just a little bit of formatting for the legend, and for that, we want the legend to be top left, and instead of stacked, we want them horizontal, like this. Now, as I mentioned before, it appears that you can use data frames and column data sources, in some cases interchangeably. If for some reason your data frame will not work, go ahead and just use a column data source instead. In this case, we've gone ahead and just used the data frame. Finally, we go ahead and we pass in our figure plot variable to show. Let's go ahead and run it. And you can see we get our group bar chart. So let's just do a quick review on this one. We've gone ahead and created our data. We create our figure for our plot. Then for each bar, we want to offset those bars and place them in the correct place on the x-axis. And for that, we use dodge that we imported here. Then we go ahead and we create our vertical bar charts, and we pass in all of the arguments to create the chart and make it look the way we want it to look. And this is just one way that you can create a group bar chart. If you'd like to explore other ways to create grouped bar charts or bar charts with multiple bars, there are several other ways and examples in the documentation. Next, let's go over how you can create a stacked area chart. We've gone ahead and created our data. Here, we've gone ahead and created our figure. We use our figure variable .v for vertical area stack. Now, once again, in this example, we're using the source. So similar to the other examples, we've gone ahead and put in our x and y arguments. In this case, we put in the y, and then we put in the x. We're going to use green and light green, and we're going to use our data frame data and assign that to source. Let's go ahead and run it. And you can see we get our stacked area plot. Okay, moving on. For our next example, we're going to go ahead and go over some scatter plots. We're going to go ahead and use the cars dataset from the Vega datasets. It looks like this. To create our scatter plot, here we have our x and y data, and we're going to compare weight in pounds to miles per gallon. We've gone ahead and created our figure, and for this scatter plot, we're going to use circle. Then we go ahead and pass in our x and y data. We want the circles to have a size of 15, with the circle line color of navy, a fill color of orange, and a transparency alpha value of 0.5. Let's go ahead and run it. And you can see we get our scatter plot. In this case, we've used circle, but there are many other variations that you can use, and we have a list of those down here. So for example, you can use a cross, you can use an X, a diamond, and so on. Let's go ahead and try a different option. Let's put in cross. And you can see we get cross. Let's go over another scatterplot example. In this case, we're going to use the iris dataset, once again from the Vega datasets. Here's a preview of the iris dataset. In this example, what we want to do is to give the different subgroups or clusters a different color and a different shape. Okay, so we've gone ahead and created our figure. We use our figure variable .scatter. We pass in the x and y data. The source is going to use the iris dataset. For the legend, we want to use species. And in this case, for the different types of markers and colors, we're going to use factor CMap and factor mark. So for the color, we use factor CMap that we pulled in here. For the markers, we use factor mark that we pulled in here. Okay, so for the colors, for the first argument, we pass in the different species. There's 3 different species, which will assign 3 different colors using the palette of dark 2, and since we have 3 colors, it's dark 2, 3. If you'd like to use a different palette, you can find those, I believe, in the Bokeh documentation. For the factors argument, we just go ahead and we pass in species, which is a list that we created right here. Now for the different markers, we're going to use 3 different types of markers. We're going to use the hex, the cross, and the triangle. So once again, for the first argument, we pass in the species. Then we go ahead and we pass in our markers list we created here. And for the third argument, we pass in the species list that we created here. We want our legend in the top left. So we've gone ahead and done that here. And we use show to show the plot. Let's go ahead and run it. And you can see we get our iris dataset scatter plot with the 3 different types, Setosa, Versicolor, Virginica, with different colors and different markers. In this next example, we're going to go over how you can create some subplots that looks like this. The first thing we've done is we've gone ahead and we've created our data for each plot. So this would be the data for the first scatter plot, the second scatter plot, and so on. Then we go ahead and create figures for each of the plots. We've done that here. And then we go ahead and create the actual scatter plots themselves. We've done that here. Then to create the actual subplots or grid plots, it's actually pretty easy. Notice that we've gone ahead and used from bokeh.layouts import gridplot. We go ahead and use gridplot, and in the round brackets, using a list, we put each of the subplots. We want the number of columns to be 2. So this will go ahead and create a 2x2 grid plot or subplot. To show all of the subplots or the grid plot, just go ahead and pass your grid variable into show that we created here. Let's go ahead and run it. And you can see we get a 2x2 grid plot with 4 different scatter plots. Next, let's go over how you can link plots. So here we have 3 different plots, and you'll notice if we move one, they all move together. Or if we zoom in, you can see that they all zoom in together. So let's go over this code. We've gone ahead and created our data, and then for each of the 3 plots, we go ahead and recreate a figure and the plot. So we have figure plot, figure plot, figure plot. For the first one, you can see we have a scatter plot with circles, then we have a line plot, and a vertical bar chart. So for the first plot, we just create it normal. Then to link it, we use the X range and the Y range. So for the X range, we use our first plot dot X range. And for the second, we use the first plot dot Y range. We do the same thing for the third one. And that should go ahead and link them up. Then we go ahead and we use grid plot. We pass in all the plots. And then we go ahead and use show to display. Okay, so a quick review. To go ahead and link these, go ahead and use the X range argument and the Y range argument, and then go ahead and assign the different plots with the X range and the Y range that you want to link together. Now in this case, we've linked the X and the Y axis. I believe you can link just one axis or the other axis or both. Okay, so for this example, we're going to go over one way that you can create a linked selection. We're going to go ahead and use the Seattle weather dataset from our Vega datasets, and that dataset looks like this. So we'll go over the code for this in just a second, but here we have 2 linked charts. Here we have a chart showing the temperature by time. So you can see around January it's cold, then obviously in the summertime the temperature goes up, and then we have fall and winter, and the temperature goes back down, and you can see the same pattern all throughout. So this gives you a broad overview of the temperatures. However, you might like to see just a little bit more detail for a certain part of the year for a specific year. So one way you can do that is to use this tool here. It's called Box Select. And let's say that we want to see this data right here. So we've selected the data, and then we can go down here, and this gives us just a little bit more information about the type of weather that was experienced at that time. So you can see that the different markers indicate the different types of weather: drizzle, rain, sun, snow, and fog. Now let's go up to our toolbar, and we want to select this and this. So we can select the chart and zoom in. So let's pull this over and go ahead and zoom in. And then you can see very specifically the type of weather that happened between January and May. And you can see that there was quite a bit of snow and quite a bit of rain. So that's just one simple example of how you could link some charts and analyze some data. So let's go over the code. We've gone ahead and used from Bokeh.transform, import factor, CMap, and factor mark. For these charts, we're going to use some specific tools, including the box select, the lasso select, reset, wheel zoom, and pan. We've created two lists for the weather types and the markers, similar to how we did with our previous example for the scatter plot. Now in this case, we're going to go ahead and use the column data source instead of just the data frame, because when I tried it with just the data frame, not everything seemed to work just right. Okay, so we use our data frame, we put that inside the round brackets of the column data source. Then we go ahead and we create our figure and our scatter plot. Now notice for this one, the x-axis is a date, so for that we use x-axis type date time, and we put in our specific tools that we created here. For the second scatter plot, we go ahead and recreate our figure and our plot. Now notice for the source, we use the same source, the Seattle weather source. We've gone ahead and moved and reformatted our legend, and we use a grid plot. So if you'd like to create some type of linked charts, you can use this code here as an example, and there are also more examples in the documentation. Before we move on, in this example, we just showed the box select. Let's go ahead and reset that. And you can also use the lasso select, okay? It's just a slightly different way of selecting your data. Okay, next up. Let's go over a few examples of how you can add labels and annotations to your chart. So here we have a pretty simple line chart, but notice that we've added some labels for the values and some annotations. For the imports, we've used from Bokeh.models.annotations. We imported the label set, and the arrow. We've also used Bokeh.models.arrowheads, and we imported the normal arrowhead. Let's go ahead and put this arrow here, up here. So we've gone ahead and created our data. Then we create our figure. Then we create our line chart. We're going to use the column data source and assign that to the source. Now, for our label, we use our label that we imported here. We put in the coordinates of where we want the label to be. Then if you want an offset, you can set that. Then you create the text for the label. Then to add that, use your figure variable, add layout, and then we pass in our label variable. If you would like to add multiple labels, you can use label set instead of label. Once again, go ahead and pass in your X's and Y's. Now since we're using the column data source, we're going to go ahead and pass in the keys here and here. For the actual labels themselves, or the text, we're going to use the Y values. Okay, so we pass in Y. And don't forget to pass in the source, which is the data variable here. If you want to create an arrow annotation, go ahead and use your figure variable, add layout, and then we use arrow that we pulled in right here. Now you might have to play with this just a little bit, but these are the characteristics and the placement for the arrow. So here we have the coordinates, and you want to set those coordinates to whatever numbers will place the arrow exactly where you want it. And if you want to change the arrowhead and the color and the fill and stuff like that, you can do that here. Okay, so this is some example code of how you can create an arrow and place it onto your chart at a specific location. Let's go ahead and run it. And you can see we have our line chart with all of the different types of labels. Next, let's go over an example of how you can create a color bar. Once again, we're going to go ahead and use our cars data frame. And in this case, we're just going to create a scatter plot, and we're going to add the color bar that represents the weight. So you can see on the x-axis we have the horsepower, and then on the y-axis we have miles per gallon. And we've added another characteristic, which would be the weight. And you can see the lower weights are the darker colors, and the higher weights are the lighter colors. For the imports, we use from Bokeh.models import linear color mapper and color bar. We also use from Bokeh.transform import transform. To create the color mapper, which maps the numbers in a range from low to high, linearly into a sequence of colors, you can think of that as a palette. We use the linear color mapper. We determine the palette that we'd like to use. And remember, there's lots of different types of palettes, and I believe those can be found in the Bokeh documentation. Then we go ahead and we assign the low and the high values. We've gone ahead and created our figure. We're going to use circle to create our scatter plot. For the source, we're going to use the cars data frame. And for the color, we use transform. The variable that we want the color bar to show is weight in pounds from the cars data frame. And then we pass in our color mapper variable that we created here. Then to render the color bar, we use color bar, pass in your color mapper. If you want a label standoff, you can put that in. Go ahead and put in location and a title. Then to add it, we use our figure variable, add layout. Pass in the color bar variable and your placement. Let's run it. And you can see we get our scatter plot with the color bar. Another thing you can do with Bokeh is that you can create maps. So here we have an example of a map, and we've also plotted some points of 3 cities in the northeast of the US. Okay, so we're not going to go over this code here too much, but basically what we've done is we've created a function that will allow us to put in our latitudes and longitudes and then convert those to a different type of coordinate, specifically the Mercator. Okay, so we have our function, and what we want to do is to put in the latitudes and longitudes for Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago. We've used our function, we put in the latitudes and longitudes, and we get back the Mercator coordinates. Here, here, and here. So then to create the map, we use from Bokeh.tileProviders, import get provider, and we've also pulled in vendors. Now for the tile provider, we use get provider, vendors, and we're going to use CartoDB positron for the type of map. Now to create the map figure, we use figure. We put in the range, which would be kind of like the zoom level for the map. And once again, that is using the Mercator coordinates. Okay, so the axis types are Mercator. Then we use our figure variable dot add tile, and we pass in the tile provider that we created here, which is the CartoDB positron. And that should give you your map. But we've also gone ahead and added 3 dots for each of those 3 cities. So we use the figure variable dot circle, and instead of the latitudes and longitudes, we used that function that converted the latitudes and longitudes into the Mercator coordinates, and we put those in for X and Y. Then for the dots or the circles, we put in size and colors. Then we use show, and we show the map. Let's go ahead and run it. Let's go ahead and use our pan tool and our zoom tool and zoom in just a little bit. So we said we wanted to plot Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland. And you can see we have those plotted here, here, and here. So for our next few examples, we're going to go over how you can create some interactive widgets that you can use with your plots, charts, and graphs. So for this example, it's a pretty simple example. We have a scatter plot where you can use a slider to interact with your plot and change the sizes of the circles. As we drag the slider over, the circles get bigger. As you drag it back left, the circles get smaller. And you also have all of your regular interactions with your toolbar here. So in order to create this interactive widget, we use from bokeh.layouts import column, from bokeh.models import slider. We create our figure, and we create our scatter plot. Then we create our widget and link. So here we've gone ahead and created our slider, and for the slider we have the start and end values, which goes from 0.1, which is the lowest, to 1, which is the largest. The increments, or the steps, are 0.01, and the initial start value is 0.2. Then here, where the magic comes in that makes the widget work, we use the slider .jslink. For the first argument, we put in value. For the second argument, we put in our plot that we created here, .glyph. And since we're changing the size of this in the form of the radius, here, we go ahead and put in radius. Then we use show, we use the column that we imported here, pass in your figure and your slider. You run it, and you get your working slider widget. Let's go over another example. In this example, we're not going to go over the code too much, but we just wanted to show you another example using a toggle button where you could add a regression line. Okay, so we have a scatter plot, and here we have our regression line. Now let's say you wanted to view this without the regression line. To create the scatter plot with the regression line, we've used this code here. Now notice for the widget, we've created a toggle button. And that toggle button, using all of this code, will allow us to either put the regression line on the chart or take it off. Let's go ahead and run this. We press the toggle button, and you can see that the regression line is gone. Press the button again, and we get our regression line back. So you can imagine you could do this with all different types of elements of the chart. For these interactive widgets, we've used the JS-link. You can also create interactive widgets using IPyWidgets. So here we have another example. We're not going to go over this code in too much detail. However, this can serve as an example to show you some of the cool things you can do with IPyWidgets and Bokeh. Here we have imported IPyWidgets. We've used from bokeh.io import push notebook, and we've imported Bokeh models range 1D. We're going to go ahead and use our Seattle weather data frame. To create our widget, we use this code here, and this is going to be a drop-down widget. Here we have our data, and then here we have our figure and our plot. Then we go ahead and we create a function here that will allow us to change and update our chart. We go ahead and use our show, like always, and then we use the IPyWidgets interact that will create the interaction between the data, the function, and the widget here. So let's go ahead and run this. And what we can do with this interactive chart and this widget, this drop-down widget, is to see the precipitation, the temperature, max and min, and the wind over the different years. So here we have 2012. Here's 2013. You can see the bars changed just a little bit. Here's 2014. And here's 2015. So that's just one simple example of how you can use IPyWidgets with Bokeh. There's another good example in the documentation. Before we finish up, let's go to the documentation and go over one more cool thing that you can do with Bokeh. So here you can see we have a scatterplot, and if you take your cursor and hover over the scatterplot dots, you can see you get different tooltips, and there's actually even images embedded into the tooltips. Okay? And if you wanted to do something like that, the code for that is here. Okay, so that's all we have for this tutorial. In our next tutorial, or the very near future, we're going to be going over the HoloViews library, which works with Bokeh. Join us again next time.